"Please end my pain," she whispered, but the rancher did the unthinkable. Backslash. The countryside was quiet, almost eerily so, with golden fields swaying gently in the wind and the occasional cow grazing lazily in the distance. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white, as she tried to push away the storm of thoughts swirling inside her mind. Her life had been full of challenges, more than most people could understand, and lately the weight of it all had become unbearable. She didn't even know why she was heading to this remote ranch. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was desperation. She wasn't sure which anymore. The ranch itself had been a suggestion from a friend who had once visited the place. They had described it as peaceful, a place where one could escape the noise of the world and find some sort of inner calm. At the time, Martha had scoffed at the idea. How could a ranch in the middle of nowhere possibly help someone like her? Yet as the days passed, the thought of isolation and quiet began to feel more appealing than anything else. Anything was better than the relentless pain she carried in her body and the constant ache in her heart. As she drove down the narrow dirt road leading to the ranch, Martha felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The road wound through hills dotted with wildflowers, and the air smelled faintly of earth and grass. Her old car rattled over stones, and she couldn't help but feel like each bump was shaking loose some part of her tension. Finally, she saw the ranch in the distance. A large wooden house stood proudly at the center, surrounded by fences and open fields. Horses grazed in the paddocks, and a few chickens wandered freely near the barn. The scene was almost too perfect, like something out of a painting, yet Martha felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. She parked the car near the house and took a deep breath. The porch was empty, and for a moment she wondered if anyone lived here at all. Then, a figure appeared from behind the house. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with rough hands and a face that seemed to have been carved by years of hard work under the sun. His eyes, however, were gentle, filled with a calm wisdom that made her feel slightly less like an intruder. "Hello," he said, his voice steady but warm. "You must be Martha. I'm Jacob. Welcome to my ranch." Martha hesitated, unsure of what to say. She wasn't used to people looking at her kindly without expecting something in return. She nodded and forced a small smile. "Hi, thank you for letting me stay here." Jacob nodded. "Come on inside, let's get you settled." The house was simple but comfortable, with wooden floors that creaked slightly underfoot and a fireplace that added warmth to the room. Jacob showed her to a small guest room that overlooked the fields. It had a modest bed, a wooden desk, and a window through which Martha could see the horses grazing in the morning light. She set down her bag and sank onto the bed, taking a moment to let herself breathe. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt a tiny bit of relief. Over the next few days, Martha began to adjust to life at the ranch. She helped Jacob with feeding the animals, cleaning the stables, and doing small chores around the house. It was hard work, and her body ached in ways she wasn't used to, but there was something comforting about it too. The routine, the simplicity, and the connection with the animals brought a sense of grounding she hadn't felt in a long time. Jacob didn't ask many questions about her past. He didn't need to. He could see the pain in her eyes, the way she flinched when someone spoke too loudly, the way her shoulders seemed permanently hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Yet he treated her with respect and kindness, offering small words of encouragement and guidance without ever prying too deeply. Martha found this refreshing. She wasn't used to people simply being present without trying to fix her or judge her. At night, Martha often sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. She thought about her life, her struggles, and the people she had lost along the way. Her mind was heavy with memories, some painful, some filled with fleeting joy. She whispered softly to herself, sometimes tears slipping down her cheeks. The isolation of the ranch made it easier to let those emotions surface, to finally acknowledge the hurt she had been trying to bury. One evening, Jacob joined her on the porch. He didn't speak at first, simply handing her a cup of warm tea. They sat in silence, watching the horses wander in the distance. Then he finally spoke, his voice calm and gentle. "Pain, it has a way of making the world feel smaller, doesn't it?" he asked. Martha looked at him, surprised. "Yes, exactly. It's like it's all I can see, all I can feel." Jacob nodded. "I know, I've seen it in many forms. Pain isn't always just physical. Sometimes it's heavier in ways people can't measure." Martha felt a lump in her throat. No one had ever understood her like that before. She wanted to explain, to tell him everything, but the words felt too heavy to leave her lips. Instead, she simply nodded, grateful for his understanding. Days turned into weeks, and Martha began to feel a slight shift within herself. The constant ache in her chest didn't disappear, but the weight felt a little lighter. She laughed softly when the animals did something silly, and she began to enjoy the simple pleasure of tending to the land. Yet, there were still moments when the darkness crept in, when the memory of her pain and loss overwhelmed her. Those moments were quiet, hidden, but they existed, whispering in the corners of her mind. One particularly cold morning, Martha was feeding the chickens when she felt a sharp pang in her chest. She dropped the basket of feed and leaned against the wooden fence, gasping for breath. Jacob appeared immediately, concern etched across his face. "Martha, are you all right?" he asked, helping her sit on a nearby bench. I think so," she whispered, her voice shaky. "It's just, sometimes it hits me out of nowhere," Jacob nodded. "I understand, pain doesn't always follow rules, but you're not alone, you're safe here." Those words, simple yet powerful, made something inside Martha stir. She realized that maybe, just maybe, she could let someone in, even if only a little. The ranch, with its quiet beauty and steady routine, was offering her something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Evenings became their shared time, sitting on the porch or walking through the fields. They didn't always speak, but the silence was comforting, filled with the unspoken understanding that sometimes, simply being there for someone is more important than words. Martha began to trust Jacob, slowly, carefully, knowing that this fragile trust was something she had never extended to anyone in years. One night, as the sky filled with stars, Martha whispered something she hadn't said out loud in a long time. "I don't know how to keep going. Sometimes it feels too much." Jacob turned to her, his expression gentle but firm. "Then we take it one day at a time, one step at a time. You don't have to do it alone." For the first time, Martha felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years: comfort, safety, and perhaps the faintest trace of hope. She realized that this remote ranch, this quiet place filled with animals, hard work, and the steady presence of Jacob, might be exactly what she needed. Not a miracle to end her pain, but a place to rest, to heal, and to find herself again. As she drifted to sleep that night, Martha felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and relief. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the pain was far from gone, but she no longer felt completely alone. The ranch had become a sanctuary, and Jacob, in his quiet way, had become a guardian of sorts, not just of the land but of her fragile, struggling heart. And for the first time in a long while, Martha allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could survive. Days passed at the ranch, each one blending gently into the next. Martha had begun to settle into a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. The mornings were filled with the soft sounds of the farm waking up, the clucking of chickens, the lowing of cows, and the occasional neigh of a horse. She often found herself moving through the chores almost automatically, her hands roughened by work, her muscles sore, yet her mind felt lighter than it had in years. Jacob was always nearby, though he never hovered. He offered guidance when needed, whether it was showing her how to properly feed the animals, mend a fence, or clean the stalls. But beyond the tasks, he offered something far more valuable: patience. Martha had spent so much of her life surrounded by people who rushed, judged, or dismissed her pain. Jacob's quiet presence was a balm, a reminder that she didn't have to prove anything or hide the hurt she carried. At first, Martha had been hesitant to talk. She was afraid that opening up would make her seem weak or burden Jacob with her problems. But the ranch had a way of softening even the hardest walls. She began to share small pieces of herself, stories from her childhood, her past struggles, and the moments that had left her heart heavy. She didn't always speak in complete sentences. Sometimes it was a whisper, a sigh, or a fleeting glance toward the sky. Yet Jacob listened, truly listened, without interruption or judgment. One afternoon, as the sun poured golden light over the fields, Martha and Jacob worked together to mend a broken fence along the edge of the pasture. The wood was old and splintered, and the nails resisted their efforts, refusing to go in smoothly. Martha's hands shook from the effort, her arms aching, and for a moment she thought about giving up. Jacob noticed and placed a steady hand on hers. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush. The fence will wait for us to do it right." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Martha felt in her chest. She realized that no one had ever treated her with such patience. She began to feel a strange warmth toward him, a trust that had been foreign to her for so long. As they worked, Jacob shared little stories about the ranch, how he had come to inherit it from his father, the lessons he had learned from years of tending to the land, and even a few humorous mishaps with the animals. Martha laughed softly at his stories, feeling a lightness in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. These moments were small, yet powerful, gradually chipping away at the layers of despair she had carried for so long. Evenings were the hardest for Martha. When the chores were done and the sun dipped below the horizon, her thoughts would wander, and the weight of her pain would press heavily against her. She often found herself sitting alone on the porch, staring at the stars, her hands resting in her lap as tears quietly slid down her cheeks. She whispered to herself about her loneliness, her fear, and the constant ache that never seemed to leave. Jacob never intruded on these moments. Sometimes he would sit quietly beside her, not speaking, just sharing the silence. Other times he would bring a warm cup of tea or a blanket, simple gestures that reminded her she was not alone. It was in these small acts of kindness that Martha began to understand the meaning of compassion. She realized that someone could care for her deeply without needing her to be strong, without demanding anything in return. One morning, as a gentle fog hung over the fields, Martha decided to try something new. She had always loved painting as a child, though she had abandoned it long ago. With a few brushes and some old paint she had brought with her, she began to capture the landscape around the ranch. The rolling hills, the grazing horses, the way the sunlight touched the fences. She painted slowly, deliberately, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease with every stroke. Jacob watched her from a distance, leaning against the doorway of the barn. He said nothing at first, simply observing how her eyes lit up with concentration, how her lips curved into a small, genuine smile. After a while he approached and nodded approvingly. "You have a gift," he said softly. "It's nice to see you finding something that makes your heart lighter." Martha smiled a little shyly. "I forgot how much I used to love this," she admitted. "It feels good to create something, even if it's just a painting of a fence and some horses." Jacob chuckled lightly. Sometimes the simplest things are the ones that matter the most. The days continued in this rhythm, filled with work, quiet conversations, and small discoveries of joy. Martha began to notice changes within herself. She could face her mornings with a bit more energy. Her evenings weren't quite as heavy, and the constant fear she had carried for so long began to loosen its grip. She felt stronger, not physically. Her body was still weak in many ways, but emotionally she started to feel a resilience she hadn't recognized in years. Despite these positive changes, Martha's inner struggles didn't disappear entirely. There were still moments when she would whisper to herself about the unbearable weight of her pain. One particularly difficult evening, as the wind howled softly through the trees, she murmured almost inaudibly, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Her hands trembled as she held the railing of the porch, her eyes staring into the dark distance. Jacob appeared beside her without a word. He didn't ask her to explain, didn't try to force her to talk. Instead, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "You're not alone," he said gently. "We'll get through this together, one day at a time." His words struck something deep within Martha. She realized that she had been carrying her pain alone for so long, believing that no one could understand. But here, on this quiet ranch, she found a presence that offered support without judgment. It was a revelation she wasn't sure she was ready to fully accept, yet she felt it in her bones. She was not alone, and perhaps she didn't have to be. One afternoon, Jacob decided to take Martha on a short walk through the woods that bordered the ranch. The path was narrow and winding, lined with tall trees whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. The air smelled of earth and leaves, crisp and refreshing. As they walked, Martha noticed the small details she had never paid attention to: the patterns of sunlight filtering through the trees, the rustle of animals hidden in the underbrush, the gentle hum of nature surrounding them. Jacob didn't speak much, but his quiet presence was comforting. Occasionally, he would point out a bird's nest or a wildflower, sharing a little knowledge about the world around them. Martha listened, absorbing the simplicity and beauty of it all. She felt a sense of connection, not just to the land but to life itself. For the first time in a long while, she could imagine a future that wasn't solely defined by pain. That evening, as they returned to the ranch, Martha felt a strange sense of gratitude. She realized that the ranch was more than just a place to hide from her troubles. It was a place of healing, a place where the gentle rhythm of life and the steady presence of another person allowed her to begin rebuilding her sense of self. She didn't have all the answers and the pain hadn't vanished, but she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile yet undeniable. In the following days, their bond grew stronger. They shared small meals together, laughed at minor accidents with the animals, and occasionally sat in silence, simply enjoying the world around them. Martha began to feel more confident, more capable, and more willing to face her inner struggles. Jacob's unwavering support showed her that healing wasn't about erasing pain entirely, but about learning to live alongside it, finding moments of light even in the darkest times. One rainy evening, as the sky turned a deep gray and raindrops tapped gently against the windows, Martha confided in Jacob something she had never told anyone. "I've felt like I was too broken for people to care," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But you make me feel like maybe I'm not as alone as I thought." Jacob looked at her, his expression calm and kind. "No one is truly alone," he said softly. "Sometimes it just takes finding the right place, the right person, to remind us of that." Martha felt tears well up in her eyes, but this time they weren't only of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of understanding, and of a budding hope that maybe life could still hold something good for her. By the end of this part of her journey, Martha had begun to understand the meaning of trust, patience, and quiet compassion. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, and the pain she carried would not vanish overnight. But with Jacob's steady guidance, the beauty of the land, and the simple routines of the ranch, she discovered that it was possible to find light in the midst of darkness. For the first time in a long while, Martha felt that she could breathe again, not fully free from pain, but free enough to begin living. The ranch was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming a place of transformation, a sanctuary where she could slowly, carefully, start to heal. The days at the ranch had grown longer and fuller for Martha. She had settled into a rhythm of work and reflection, and though her pain had not vanished, she had learned to carry it differently, less like a heavy chain and more like a shadow that followed her quietly. But some nights, when the world was dark and silent, that shadow became unbearable, pressing against her chest with a weight she could no longer ignore. One evening, after finishing the day's chores, Martha found herself wandering to her favorite spot on the porch. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of violet and deep orange in the sky. The animals were settled for the night, the distant hills glimmered in the fading light, and the gentle hum of crickets filled the air. Everything appeared peaceful, almost perfect, yet inside her a storm raged. She sat quietly, holding a cup of warm tea, trying to convince herself that the ache in her heart would pass. But it wouldn't. The memories, the regrets, the losses, all of it surged forward like a tide she could not stop. For the first time in weeks, she felt the loneliness she had tried to hide from herself come crashing down. She realized she could no longer carry the burden alone. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice trembling. He had been sitting nearby, reading quietly, but he immediately looked up, concern clouding his features. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, setting his book down. Martha shook her head, unable to speak. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her chest felt tight, her thoughts tangled. I, I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. "The pain, it's too much. I don't see a way out." Jacob moved closer, sitting beside her on the porch swing. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he let her words hang in the air, letting her know that she could be honest without fear of judgment. He could see the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the fatigue etched into every line of her face. "I've never felt so tired of living," Martha continued, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Every day feels like a fight I'm losing. Sometimes I just want it to stop. I don't want to feel this pain anymore." Jacob's heart ached at her words. He had seen many people struggle with challenges before, but there was something about Martha's suffering that reached deep into him. He knew that what she was saying was more than just a passing moment of sadness. It was a plea, a quiet call for someone to understand the depths of her despair. "You're not alone," Jacob said softly, placing a steady hand on hers. "I can't take away the pain, but I can be here with you. We can face it together." Martha's shoulders shook as she tried to absorb his words. She had spent so long believing that no one could understand her, that no one could share the weight she carried. And yet here was Jacob, sitting beside her, offering presence, patience, and understanding. For a moment she allowed herself to believe it. "I don't know if I can keep going," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Sometimes I wish it could just end." Jacob's hand tightened around hers, a silent promise that he would not let her face her darkness alone. He understood the gravity of her words. They were not a fleeting thought, they were the cry of a soul pushed to its limits. "I hear you," he said gently. "I see your pain and I know it feels unbearable, but you're stronger than you think. Even when it doesn't feel like it, you've been surviving every day, and I'll be here to help you keep going." Martha looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She had never been offered support like this before, not in the way that Jacob was offering it, not without expectation or judgment. She wanted to believe him, but the darkness within her was stubborn, clawing its way back. For the next few days, Martha struggled with her feelings more than ever. She tried to focus on the ranch, the animals, and the small routines that had begun to ground her. She fed the horses, cleaned the stables, and painted in her quiet moments, but the ache in her chest lingered. At night, she would often find herself staring at the stars, whispering her fears into the darkness, feeling as if no one could hear her cries. Jacob noticed her struggles. He observed the subtle changes, the way she moved more slowly, the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched when the wind carried a certain sound. He didn't push her to talk, but he made himself available, offering comfort in small ways. A warm blanket, a gentle reminder to rest, or a quiet presence by her side. One afternoon, As they were walking through the fields checking on the animals, Martha finally broke down completely. She sank to the ground beside the fence, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs, and Jacob knelt beside her, not speaking, just holding her steady. "I don't want to live like this anymore," she whispered between sobs. I can't handle the pain. Please, I just want it to end." The words cut through the quiet of the ranch like a knife. Jacob's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that in moments like these, panic could make things worse. He needed to offer clarity, strength, and hope, even when her words were filled with despair. "You're not alone, Martha," he said softly. "I'm here with you, I hear you, and I will not let you face this by yourself." She looked at him, her eyes red and glistening with tears. "But I don't know how to keep going," she admitted. "It hurts too much. Every day it hurts too much." Jacob reached out and took her hand firmly. "I know it does, and I know it feels impossible right now, but ending it isn't the answer. You are not just your pain. You are so much more than the suffering you feel." Martha's chest heaved as she tried to absorb his words. The darkness was still there, but for the first time there was a flicker of light, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face her struggles alone. Over the next few days, Jacob worked quietly to provide support. He organized small routines to help her cope with her pain, whether it was tending to the animals, going for walks in nature, or practicing breathing exercises to calm her mind. He encouraged her to express herself through painting and journaling, giving her tools to release the emotions that had been trapped inside for so long. Slowly, Martha began to respond. The despair didn't disappear, but it became manageable in a way it hadn't been before. She still had moments of intense sadness, moments when she whispered to herself about the weight of her pain, but she also began to recognize moments of relief and joy. A smile returned to her face when she successfully painted a landscape, when a horse nuzzled her hand, or when the sun shone through the clouds after a rainstorm. Jacob continued to stand by her, not as someone who demanded her to be strong, but as someone who understood that healing was a process, not an instant solution. He reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there could be light, even if it was small and fleeting. One night, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars, Martha whispered again, softer this time, "I don't know how to keep going, but I feel like maybe I can, just a little." Jacob smiled gently. "That's all we can do, take it one step at a time. And I'll be here for every step, no matter how small." For the first time, Martha felt a sense of relief she hadn't known in years. She realized that the ranch was not just a place to escape from her pain. It was a place where she could face it safely, with someone who understood, without judgment or fear. She began to trust that even though her journey was far from over, she did not have to walk it alone. That night, as she lay in bed, Martha felt a fragile hope take root in her heart. The ache of her pain remained, but it was no longer a crushing weight. She could breathe, she could rest, and she could imagine a future where moments of happiness and relief were possible. The darkness had not vanished, but for the first time she felt capable of surviving it, and perhaps even finding moments of light along the way. The days following Martha's emotional breakdown were quiet, yet they carried a new weight, a weight not of despair, but of possibility. Jacob could see that the depth of her pain had not vanished, and he knew that her whispered pleas were not just cries of the moment. They were a call for something deeper, something beyond what simple comfort could provide. He understood that Martha needed more than quiet presence. She needed guidance, support, and a path to healing that she could hold on to. Jacob began planning carefully. He could not simply ignore her pleas, nor could he pretend that time alone would solve her struggles. He had seen too many people crushed by the weight of their inner battles. What Martha needed was a structured approach, one that combined her natural connection to the ranch with professional support. He decided that the unthinkable, but life-changing, step would be to reach out for help beyond the ranch, something Martha had never done before. The next morning, Jacob suggested they take a drive to the nearby town. He didn't explain too much at first, only emphasizing that it would be a short trip and that she could turn back if she wanted. Martha hesitated, anxiety flickering in her eyes, but she trusted Jacob enough to agree. The ride was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the spaces between their thoughts. Martha stared out the window, watching the fields and forests blur by, her mind racing with anticipation and fear. Jacob finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he began gently, "that maybe it's time we try something new, something that could help you more than I alone can. There are people trained to help with pain like yours, not just physical but emotional. They could give you tools to handle the weight you carry." Martha's heart pounded. She had spent so long believing that no one could help her, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But something in Jacob's voice, the calm, unwavering certainty, made her pause. She felt a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. "Do you really think it could help?" she asked softly. "I do," Jacob replied firmly. "I know it feels scary and it's a big step, but sometimes the unthinkable things are the ones that save us." When they arrived in town, Jacob led her to a small clinic that specialized in both physical and emotional healing. The building was modest, warm, and welcoming, nothing like the cold, clinical environment she had feared. A kind receptionist greeted them, and soon Martha was sitting in a room with a counselor who listened with patience, asking gentle questions and providing understanding without judgment. At first, Martha was hesitant, her answers clipped and careful. She had spent so long holding her emotions inside, convincing herself that speaking about them would make them more real, more painful. But the counselor's calm presence slowly chipped away at her resistance. She found herself speaking about the chronic pain that had haunted her body, the losses that had hollowed her heart, and the loneliness that had followed her every day. With each word, she felt a small release, a subtle lightening of the burden she had carried alone for so long. Jacob waited outside, giving her space, yet remaining nearby. He knew that the true act of compassion was not just offering comfort, but also empowering Martha to take steps toward her own healing. When she finally emerged from the room, her eyes were red from tears, but they held a glimmer of hope. "How do you feel?" he asked gently, offering her a reassuring smile. Lighter somehow," she admitted, her voice tentative. "It's scary but also good. I feel like maybe I can try." Over the following weeks, Jacob continued to support her, balancing life on the ranch with the guidance and exercises suggested by her counselors and doctors. He encouraged her to follow routines, take gentle walks in nature, and engage in her creative outlets like painting and journaling. He also introduced mindfulness practices, small, practical steps to help her focus on the present instead of being consumed by memories of pain or fear of the future. Martha responded gradually. The days were not perfect. She still experienced waves of despair, moments when the weight of her pain pressed down like a heavy stone. But now, she had tools and people to help her navigate these moments, including Jacob's steady presence. She began to recognize that healing was not a straight path but a series of small steps, each one building on the last. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, Martha found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in months. A young foal had escaped from its pen, running around the field in a flurry of excitement, and Martha had chased it with Jacob, their laughter echoing across the open land. For a fleeting moment, the darkness that had haunted her seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by the simple joy of the moment. Jacob watched her carefully, noting the subtle changes, the way her shoulders relaxed, the sparkle returning to her eyes, the way she moved with a little more freedom. He knew there was still a long journey ahead, but these small victories were important. They were evidence that life, even with its pain, could still hold moments of beauty and connection. One afternoon, Jacob introduced a new routine. He suggested they spend mornings tending to the ranch together and afternoons exploring creative outlets or quiet reflection. He emphasized that each day would be a step forward, not a race. Martha agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She began to wake up each morning with a small spark of motivation, eager to engage with the animals, the land, and the small tasks that brought her closer to a sense of normalcy. Despite her progress, there were still moments of fear and hesitation. One rainy evening, as she sat by the window watching raindrops streak across the glass, Martha whispered to Jacob, "What if the pain never really goes away? What if I'm always like this?" Jacob took her hand, holding it firmly yet gently. "Then we live alongside it," he said. "We don't let it define us. You're learning to find moments of light even when the darkness is present, and I'll be here every step of the way." This became the turning point for Martha. She began to understand that true healing was not about erasing pain completely, but about discovering the strength to endure it, the courage to seek help, and the patience to embrace life one day at a time. The unthinkable action Jacob had taken, reaching out for help beyond the ranch, connecting her with professionals, had opened a door she never thought she could pass through. As weeks turned into months, Martha's relationship with Jacob grew stronger. It was not romantic or dramatic. It was a bond forged through trust, compassion, and shared experience. She came to understand that healing was not a solitary journey. Sometimes it required others to walk beside you, to guide you gently, and to remind you of your own strength when you could not see it yourself. One morning, Martha found herself standing in the middle of a sunlit field, feeling the warmth on her face and the soft wind in her hair. She took a deep breath and realized that, for the first time in a long while, she felt alive, not unburdened but resilient. The ranch had become more than a sanctuary. It was a place of transformation, a place where despair could be met with action, understanding, and hope. Jacob joined her in the field, and without a word they stood side by side, sharing a quiet moment of connection. Martha smiled faintly, a smile that carried with it gratitude, relief, and the beginnings of inner peace. She knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but she also knew she was not facing them alone. The unthinkable act of compassion, the act that had seemed impossible at first, had changed her life. Jacob had not simply offered comfort, he had offered her a path to healing, a lifeline in a world that had once seemed overwhelmingly dark. And in that moment, Martha understood something profound. Sometimes, the most courageous and life-saving actions are the ones that defy expectation, that challenge fear, and that open the door to hope when it feels impossible to find. Months had passed since Martha first arrived. At the ranch, the seasons had shifted subtly. The golden warmth of summer had given way to the soft, crisp mornings of autumn, and the ranch had grown quiet and calm in the gentle rhythm of daily life. For Martha, the days were no longer filled with the constant ache that had once shadowed every step. The pain remained, but it was no longer unbearable. She had learned, through patience, support, and her own quiet courage, to carry it differently, to live alongside it instead of letting it define her. Her mornings were spent tending to the animals and the land, routines that had once felt exhausting now bringing a sense of purpose and grounding. She rose with the sun, brushing down the horses, feeding the chickens, and helping Jacob with the daily chores around the ranch. The simple acts of care, the touch of a soft muzzle, the warm clucking of chickens, the sound of horses' hooves on the earth, brought her moments of peace she had not imagined possible. Jacob was always there, but not in a way that smothered her. He was a steady presence, offering guidance, encouragement, and quiet companionship. Over time, Martha realized that her trust in him had deepened into a profound bond, a bond built not on words alone, but on understanding, patience, and shared experience. There was comfort in knowing someone could see her struggles, respect them, and still encourage her to grow. Afternoons were reserved for reflection and creativity. Martha had returned to her painting, her brushes and colors becoming extensions of her emotions, allowing her to express feelings she had long suppressed. Each stroke of the brush, each line and color on the canvas was a release, a step toward healing. Sometimes she painted the landscapes she saw around the ranch, sometimes the animals, and sometimes abstract forms that mirrored the complex emotions inside her. One particularly bright afternoon, she found herself painting a scene of the ranch at sunrise, the first light touching the fields in soft gold and pink. She paused for a moment, stepping back from her work to take it in. For the first time, she saw not just the beauty of the ranch, but the reflection of her own growth. The painting captured not only the landscape, but the journey she had taken, the moments of despair, the small victories, and the fragile hope that had grown into resilience. Jacob watched her from a distance, leaning against the doorway of the barn. He smiled quietly, seeing the transformation not only in her art but in the woman herself. "You've come a long way," he said softly, approaching her. "I'm proud of you." Martha looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. "I couldn't have done it alone," she admitted. "You've been everything I needed without even knowing it." Jacob shook his head gently. "You did all the hard work. I only offered guidance and support. The strength was always inside you. You just needed the chance to see it." The afternoons often flowed into quiet evenings, where they would sit together on the porch, sharing stories, observing the animals, or simply enjoying the serenity of the land. On some nights, the weight of the past would briefly resurface, and Martha would confess her lingering fears or sadness. But these moments were now interspersed with laughter, lightness, and a growing sense of self-assurance. She no longer felt defined solely by her pain. She was discovering a version of herself capable of hope, joy, and resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of violet and orange, Martha and Jacob walked to the far end of the pasture. A gentle breeze carried the scent of grass and earth, and the soft sounds of the ranch filled the air, the lowing of cows, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional whinny of a horse. Martha paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. "I never imagined I could feel like this," she said quietly, her voice tinged with awe. "I thought this pain would follow me forever, unchanging, unrelenting. But now I can breathe again. I can see light, even if it's small." Jacob nodded, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You've done the work, Martha. The ranch and I have only been guides. The change came from you, from your courage to face your pain and take steps toward healing." For the first time in months, Martha allowed herself to feel a sense of real accomplishment. She realized that healing was not about erasing the past or pretending the pain never existed. It was about learning to carry it differently, to find moments of light amid the darkness, and to embrace life with all its imperfections. In the weeks that followed, Martha took on more responsibility at the ranch. She began organizing small projects, such as planting flowers near the barn, building a small vegetable garden, and helping with the care of younger animals. Each task brought her a sense of purpose and pride. She noticed how the land responded to her care, how the animals grew healthier and happier, and how the routines grounded her in ways therapy and conversations alone never could. Her relationship with Jacob continued to grow into one of mutual respect and deep friendship. They shared silent moments, laughter, and the occasional playful arguments over chores, yet the foundation of their bond remained the unwavering support they offered each other. Martha no longer felt isolated, and Jacob no longer felt the weight of helplessness in the face of her struggles. Together, they created a rhythm of life that balanced work, reflection, and care. One crisp morning, Martha decided to take a walk alone through the woods that bordered the ranch. The leaves were turning golden and red, and the scent of autumn filled the air. As she walked, she reflected on her journey, The darkness she had faced, the moments of despair, and the unthinkable act of compassion Jacob had taken by connecting her with professional support. She realized that this ranch, this land, and this quiet life had given her something far more valuable than comfort. It had given her the tools to live, even in the presence of her pain. When she returned to the house, Jacob greeted her with a smile and a warm cup of tea. They sat together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the fields, the light reflecting off the horses' coats and the dewy grass. Martha felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Jacob, not just for the ranch, but for the realization that life could hold meaning even after suffering. "I feel different," she said softly, sipping her tea. "I'm not the same person who arrived here months ago. I still have pain, but I feel stronger. I feel like I can keep going." Jacob nodded, a calm smile on his face. "That's the gift of hope and resilience. You found it inside yourself, and I'm proud to have witnessed your journey." As the days continued, Martha became more engaged with the local community, sharing small skills she had learned at the ranch and helping neighbors with their own projects. Her confidence grew, and she began to see herself not as a person defined by struggle, but as someone capable of growth, contribution, and even joy. Evenings were often spent quietly, reflecting on the day or planning for the future. Martha had learned to appreciate the simple pleasures, the sound of the wind through the trees, the warmth of sunlight on her face, and the companionship of someone who truly cared. She realized that life's value was not measured by the absence of pain, but by the presence of connection, purpose, and moments of beauty. One particularly peaceful evening, as the sky filled with stars, Martha looked at Jacob and whispered, "Thank you for everything. For listening, for guiding me, and for showing me that life is worth living even when it's hard." Jacob smiled softly, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "You did all the hard work, Martha. I only walked beside you. The courage was always yours. Remember that." Martha leaned back, letting the night sky wash over her. She felt a profound sense of peace, not because life had become perfect, but because she had learned to navigate it with strength, resilience, and hope. She realized that the ranch had not just saved her from despair. It had helped her discover herself, her capabilities, and the quiet joy of living even with imperfection. As she drifted to sleep that night, Martha felt gratitude fill her heart. She had survived the darkness, faced her deepest fears, and emerged not unscathed, but stronger and more capable than she had ever imagined. The journey had been difficult, sometimes terrifying, but it had led her to a place of understanding and hope. The ranch had become more than a refuge. It was a home, a place of healing, and a testament to the power of compassion, patience, and unwavering support. Martha knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but she also knew she was not alone. With Jacob's guidance and the tools she had discovered within herself, she was ready to face the future with courage, resilience, and the knowledge that life, even with pain, could hold moments of profound beauty. For the first time in years, Martha felt truly alive, not free from the past, not untouched by pain, but fully present, fully capable of hope, and fully ready to embrace life's possibilities.